Today I thought we'd take a look at the Carmine Ambush Tercio, and this is a formation that I just finished painting up maybe a month and a half ago, and I thought I'd share it with you today and how I painted it and what the story is, the lore behind this formation, and how it performs on the table. So what is the Talern Carmine Ambush Tercio? Well, as you might have guessed from the book that's on the right there, it is part of the Devastation of Talern supplement, or it comes in that supplement, and it features pretty heavily. This is a formation derived from the Talern Reborn cohort, which is derived from a nucleus of Solar Auxilia veterans that had retired on Talern after the world was conquered. And this is a practice that the Imperium has continued even from the time of the Horus Heresy all the way up to Warhammer 40k, and it's something very similar to what the Romans did in ancient times when soldiers retired. Part of the reward for their service was something called a stipendium, and this was a certain amount of land and a place of often a position of respect and honor in a new city that was founded in the conquered lands. And this did several things. I mean, it rewarded soldiers without necessarily needing to provide them with physical money, which was good for the Romans, who were often strapped for cash to pay for their very large military. But it was also a way to inexpensively garrison newly conquered lands, which, as you may imagine, were often somewhat restive. And the presence of a large group of veteran, if somewhat older soldiers, with a great deal to lose if their province rebelled successfully, was a good way for the empire to maintain a semi-standing military force without having to invest a lot of their active reserves into that province. So anyway, something very similar happens here. These retired Solar Auxilia are on Talern when it gets attacked by the Iron Warriors, and they provide a core of veterans who have a lot of military experience, of elite military experience, and they're able to really establish enough of a force to allow the remnants of the Talon population to make the best use of these massive reserves that are placed in these underground warehouses that Talern is so famous for. So that's maybe enough about that. But the formation is designed to showcase how the Talon Reborn cohort fought, and they used hit and run tactics, utilizing the unique terrain created by the virus bombing of Talern, the fog, the just the very treacherous terrain, to execute these hit and run strikes on the Iron Warriors. And we already know, right, that armored warfare is one of the ways in which conventional human forces are much more able to compete with Astartes, right? The power difference between the two is much less when you're talking about tank-on-tank action um, versus fighting man-to-man, basically. So obviously, you know, a 6-foot soldier, even an elite Imperial soldier, is going to be far more outmatched against an Astartes in power armor than maybe a Leman Russ crewman against a Predator crew. So this formation is designed to replicate those hit and run tactics. So as you can see, as I've been showing you, there are 5 detachments in the formation. The first 3 up front, the 3 Leman Russ detachments, are the mandatory detachments that you must take as part of the formation. And you can see that there is 1 detachment of Leman Russ Executioners, 1 of Leman Russ Annihilators, and then, of course, the premier anti-tank detachment, the Leman Russ Vanquishers. So these all have las cannons in the hull to help with their primarily anti-armor role. We also have 2 detachments of 4 Ethon Heavy Sentinels, and these are optional detachments that you do not have to take, but I think they are a great way to round out the detachment. The Ethon is a very good detachment just in general, has a lot of capabilities, even with the missile launcher nerf or debuff that that all missile launchers suffered from the Libra Strategia. But they're still a great unit. They're a good way to cover your flanks, um, and just to, as an extra action, right, to scout and move forward and keep your enemy off balance. So how did I paint these miniatures? Well, these are the paints that I used over here. And you can see I started off with a Talisman Teal from Army War Paints. And I used this through an airbrush. I diluted it about 3-to-1 with Army Painter's airbrush medium. And I was really quite impressed with how well it went through the airbrush. It did need quite a bit of dilution, but I mean, it's not a dedicated airbrush paint, so I don't think that's a huge surprise. Now you can see that this paint is quite a bit darker. If I could show you, this paint is quite a bit darker than what's on the tank right now, and that's of course because I just used this as a base color, and then I used Aqua Alchemy as the primary color tone for the tanks. Well, for the whole formation, really. And so that was the main base coat, and the Talisman Teal is really, I don't know if you can quite see, but it's just in the crevices there to give it a shadow color. And then last of all, I used Amulet Aqua, also from Army Painter, and that was I guess they call it color modulation, I think is the term if I'm remembering correctly. And that was used on the bottom of the hull, if you can see there, and then on the tops of the hull and the turret, and that's to give the effect of lighting. So after that, I also used, for the red panels, I used this violet red from Reaper Master Series, which is an older American brand. I think they're doing a new Kickstarter now. But these are pretty good paints. I think they're probably more suited for fine painting because they're quite thin, and I think they're really designed to be used for people who are trying to paint figures to not a competition standard necessarily, but to a higher standard perhaps than I'm attempting to perform here. But you can see I've used that on the stripes on the Ethon Sentinels, and you can probably tell that I freehanded those. And then, of course, also on the faceplates for the tank commanders. And I tried to give each platoon a tank commander just to mix it up a little bit. I don't think this, of course, came out before we had a lot of pintle options, so the pintle is just for aesthetics. But I like having the tank commanders there just in case I want to use them in a formation that needs a tank commander, and it breaks things up as well. So up next, I used Tenebrous Gray from AK. This is Generation 3, I believe. I really like this color for my blacks because it's just black enough to look black. And you can see that on the tips of the las cannons there, and then in a few other places. But it's just black enough to get a sense of the color. I used it also on the multi-lasers on the Ethon Sentinels. But it's not so black that it looks artificial, which, I mean, I suppose, of course, it is artificial, but things are rarely like this true black. And I think often if we paint things just a direct, like coal black, it doesn't look quite right. So I like this gray color as a multi-purpose or general purpose tool in my paint palette, if you will. For all of the metallics throughout the formation, I used this exhaust manifold. It's pretty old. I've probably had this for a couple years, as you may have guessed by how messy the bottle is. That is one of the problems with these paints, is that the caps can tend to spray color and they get pretty messy. But I really recommend acrylic Vallejo's metal colors just because they cover very well. They are primarily airbrush. So if you do want to airbrush metals, I highly recommend these. But even for brush painting, as long as you make sure to take care to control the paint on your brush, I think you really can't beat these metallics. But I use these on everything except for the tank tracks. I mixed this, I think, 3-to-1 with a red brown. That was another Master Series color, but I think any generic red brown, probably Rhinox hide, I think would be the Citadel equivalent. But I got this really nice reddish metallic. So it gives a little bit of a sense of rust, of worn metal, without making it too extreme, which I didn't want. But you can also see on the sides here, I've got that nice trim, and that was with the straight exhaust manifold. And then for the copper details, I used the same brand, Vallejo acrylic metal color. Used copper. Now, the one downside with the metal color is that they have a huge range of silvers, but they don't really have. They have a copper, and then they have one gold, which is itself so pale that it is almost itself a silver. And so it's really not. You're going to have to go elsewhere if you're looking for a broad range of kind of gold or copper colored metallics. But because they cover so well, I do use the copper from Vallejo Metal Colors. I just do two coats of the color, and then I use a Reichland Flesh Shade to shade it and to kind of bring out that reddish tone from the copper and make it a little stronger. I believe for the general metallics, like the gun barrels and so on, I used also Citadel Nuln Oil to get that shade on there. And that's pretty much it, guys, for the Commanders. I did go through and brush paint on the Aqua Alchemy, and then used the violet red to accent the faceplates. And then I think I also used the exhaust manifold on their bodies for their plate armor. And I think it's important to do the brush paint as opposed to just leaving them airbrushed, because it's going to change the texture and tone of the color when you apply it with a brush versus with an airbrush. And that is going to give it just enough to separate it from the model and make it look different and alive. And I think that's another good point to talk about, just about painting Legions Imperialis in general, is that you don't really need to get super detailed. I mean, I know I'm not the best painter here, but I think these look pretty good. And as you can tell from the description, I didn't really do all that much to them. I just focused on trying to break up the silhouette and painting just enough. As you can see here, I've got the metallic colors on the legs, the white on the tips of the missiles in the rocket pods, the rockets in the rocket pods. And it didn't take that much work, but I think they really come to life. And I think the key to that is just making sure that there's not these broad expanses of color that aren't broken up. And I think there are a few more details maybe I need to talk about. On the exhaust pipes, I used exhaust manifold again appropriately, and then I used a wash of, I'll turn one around, maybe you can see it a little bit better. And then I used a wash of a rust pigment powder. I think any one would work. And I mixed it with, I think, just an airbrush thinner or an airbrush medium, and just brushed it over. And you can see how that just breaks everything up and makes it look a bit more alive. Am I missing anything? I think I did do some stippling with a makeup brush, and I think just this black, and just along the sides of the tank, just to make them look weathered. And that was, of course, before I applied any of the details. And then last of all, I used a oil wash of Abteilung 502 Smoke, and I just used that in the recesses of the tank, and then washed away any excess with mineral spirits. And do make sure, if you're going to do that, make sure to do it in a ventilated area and use odorless mineral spirits if you can. And that's about it, guys. I think we're going to go back to the studio now, and I'm going to talk to you about how this formation performs in-game. The Carmine Ambush Tercio is an iconic formation for Legion's Imperialis, and as an iconic formation, it comes with some advantages and some disadvantages, and some restrictions. And the first advantage is the fact that taking all these detachments, including the optional ones, is going to cost you 575 points. Whereas if you purchase these at quote unquote list price, it's going to cost you 625 points. So you're saving about 50 points here. There are some restrictions, as I said. As a iconic formation, this particular formation, as the Defenders of Talon, can only be included in a Loyalist army. And even for a Loyalist army, you can only include a single one of these formations. As a detachment in this formation, you get the forward deployment and the scout special rules. So all of your Leman Russ, all of your Ethon Heavy Sentinels get forward deployment and scout. And we're going to talk about whether that's a big advantage or not later on in the video. So let's talk about each of these formations individually. Generally, I'm sure my viewers are pretty familiar with these by now, but let's talk about them as an aggregate. And you get 2 detachments of these Ethon Heavy Sentinels. You get 4 in each detachment. And as we probably know, these are a very strong unit in Legions Imperialis. They're multi-role. They have the capabilities to attack heavy armor, or excuse me, they have heavy infantry, light armor, infantry and cover with their missile launchers and with their multi-lasers. And they're a fairly cheap detachment, and they're quick. They move 7 inches. They're a walker, so they're able to maneuver through difficult terrain without slowing down. The only real downside, of course, is that they are pretty fragile. They're not armored like many other walkers are, so even light weapons are going to tear right through these guys with their 4-up save. And so that can be kind of a downside, especially with a small detachment size like we see here in this formation. Next up, we have the Leman Russ Executioner. And like all Leman Russ variants, it has some pretty strong points to it. It's got good armor with a save of 2. It has a good movement value of 8. And, these are all good things. The main problem for me for the Executioner is simply the weak main gun. The plasma cannon is basically a slightly better multi-laser. You get a better to hit and you get an AP value. But for me, I'm really looking for my tanks to be able to take on enemy armor. And for this detachment, the Executioner plasma cannon is just too weak. You really have to get around to the flanks to start doing any major damage to enemy armor. Unless it's light armor, I suppose. But even in that case, the low range of 12 inches is really letting you down. It does have a las cannon in the hull for this formation, which, a las cannon on a fast, well-armored chassis is not nothing. But, of course, as we'll talk about a little later, there are other options in the Solar Auxiliary list which might be preferable. The Leman Russ Annihilator, again, very similar situation. It's slightly more expensive. It has good armor. It's quick. The main gun, it's a twin las cannon, so it's got a 22-inch range, hitting on 4s, and it's accurate. Again, this is a 2 las cannon chassis, fast, well armored. There's not a lot to dislike here. Again, we just come up to the fact that it is not a Leman Russ Vanquisher, which has good armor, quick, just like every other Leman Russ chassis, right? But it has a main gun with 32-inch range, hits on 4s, AP -2, and armor bane. So, as we all know, the Leman Russ Vanquisher is kind of the king of the hill. And it's just difficult to see really any other option being competitive at this point in the game's life cycle with the Leman Russ Vanquisher. Now, to Games Workshop's credit, they have nerfed, or they have reduced the points of the Leman Russ, the Annihilator, and the Executioner. They cost fewer points than the Vanquisher now. But again, the Annihilator is 170 points, and the Leman Russ Vanquisher is 175. So is the Leman Russ Vanquisher only 5 points better than the Annihilator? I would probably not make that point. I think it is far more than 5 points better. So let's look at the special rules now. The Scout and Forward Deployment are the two special rules that we get here. Let's look at Scout first. It improves cover saves for detachments with that special rule. And this on the surface sounds really good. It is useful for the fragile Ethon Sentinels. If you're in obscuring terrain, you're going to have a 4+ cover save, which is not bad. However, that's their standard cover save. So if you're taking a cover save against, you're taking 4-up cover save against anti-tank weapons or light AT weapons, that's going to help you. But you're going to be facing off against light weapons from enemy infantry, and you're still going to be relying on your 4-up save, which you're going to lose a pretty strong, pretty high percentage of your detachment fairly quickly. And then you're going to be taking a morale save, which means your detachment with the weaker morale that Solar Auxilia have, your detachment's probably going to be falling back, and you generally don't want to have these guys be taking too much fire. So Scout, for them, it is useful, can be helpful in some situations. I don't think it's a huge benefit. The other problem with Scout is that it's unlikely to help your Leman Russ. The Leman Russ already have a 2-up cover save, or excuse me, a 2-up armor save. So there are very few situations where that +1 to their cover save is going to be better than the armor save that they're already getting. Maybe if you put them in some obscuring terrain, then they've got a 4-up. So if you get hit with an AP -3 weapon, which, let's face it, is pretty rare, then you might be able to take your cover save and get some help from it. But otherwise, pretty unlikely that this armor save is going to be doing much for you, unless you fight against Titans a lot. But of course, the other problem is you probably don't want your Leman Russ in obscuring terrain all that much, especially considering the Executioner and the Annihilator fairly short-ranged, right? So they want to be moving up the table and putting fire on the enemy. Unlike the Vanquisher, with that 32-inch range, can afford to sit in obscuring terrain somewhere on the back line and just put fire on the enemy. The Executioner, the Annihilator are going to have to be maneuvering to get those shots. So if you're putting them in cover in that obscuring terrain, obstructing terrain, excuse me, you're going to be slowing them down, and already you're going to be reducing their ability to maneuver to get those shots. So I think Scout is kind of a non-entity for the Leman Russ. So it's a mixed bag there for me. Forward deployment, it can be useful. I mean, forward deployment is a great rule. It allows you to adjust your deployment after seeing what your enemy has done, especially with these tanks. Getting them up the table a little bit faster, especially for the Leman Russ Executioner, is going to be very helpful. Getting them in range faster, letting them maybe deploy or shift their deployment out of range or line of sight of some powerful enemy weapons, or perhaps getting them into range of their own guns, especially for the Leman Russ Vanquisher, or maybe even the Annihilator. Putting them in cover, maybe if they have if we're talking about the Leman Russ Vanquisher, or getting them into position to put fire on the enemy, can be helpful. Is it a game changer? Probably not. This is something that is nice to have, but not really it doesn't take this formation into something that everybody is going to be wanting to use in their armies. The other problem with forward deployment, though, is that the Ethon Heavy Sentinels already have forward deployment, so it's not really giving them any benefit that they already have. So as we can see, the special rules, kind of a mixed bag here. So overall, let's look at some of the pros and cons of the Carmine Ambush Tercio.
Starting with the pros, you do save 50 points over the list price, which is not nothing. The Ethon Sentinels are slightly tougher in cover, and you can reposition your armor detachments after deployment, which is thematic given the overall theme of this formation, which is to ambush vulnerable enemy detachments. Some cons of the formation, though, as we've been discussing, the Executioners and the Annihilators to a lesser degree just are not really worth taking just because the Leman Russ Vanquisher is just better. The Scout special rule is rarely going to help your Leman Russ, and the Ethons already have forward deployment. So, in many cases, only half or a quarter of your formation is going to be making the best use of these special rules that are part of the whole point of taking this formation. And I think you also are going to be wanting more than 4 Ethons in your detachment, just because they are so fragile that the minute they start taking fire, they're just going to melt away. Especially if you only have 4 of them, you take 2 casualties, you're already taking a morale check, and on a 50% chance, they're going to be falling back off the table potentially. So I kind of feel like they really need to have at least 6 to have enough staying power on the table to really have enough presence, have enough staying power, like I said, to be putting fire on the enemy for at least a turn or two before they're destroyed or falling back. So, in summary, I think this is not really an optimal choice for the Solar Auxilia, right? Like I don't like talking too much about like playing competitively. I'm not super into that, but we also want to make smart choices about what we're doing in a game, and making some simple value calculations is not necessarily being a competitive try hard, right? So um, this formation I think is really fun and thematic. It's an ambush themed unit with forward deployment and scout and all this stuff, and it's just neat. And I think it, like all iconic formations, it's kind of a challenge because no battlefield commander ever goes into an engagement with exactly what they want, right? So working with the restrictions of the iconic formations, of having the maybe not optimal weapons mounted on your vehicles, and just finding ways to make the best use of them. It's an interesting tactical challenge, and I think it's neat to try, and it's worth playing with and enjoying for the tactical challenge. And they have a cool paint scheme. I think that metal banding looks really nice. I think the bluish green looks really good. And with the red panels too, I think that's quite striking. And I think they just have an interesting backstory as well. And so it may not be the optimal choice, but I think this is a fun formation that you can try in your Solar Auxilia armies and just try it for a challenge, maybe. I am interested to know what your guys' thoughts are. Have you played with this formation before? I've had a couple games with it, but if you have, please let me know what your experience was like and what you thought about the combination of detachments, how they performed on the table. And if you enjoyed the video, just please do like and subscribe to see more like this. See you next time.